Hi, my cat and I are coming to you from my living room in the United States, which let's hope is not about to elect Donald Trump as its next president. In any case, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference organizers for inviting me to give this talk. And when I could not come due to a death in the family, suggested I make the presentation in this form. I'm really sorry to miss because IACR is the conference where I feel most at home. My talk is a complicated one, so I hope it comes through. You're able to follow it through this movie version. The title is Dehumanization in Theory, Anti-humanism, non-humanism, post-humanism, and trans-humanism. So the first thing I'd like to do is explain the title. The theme of the conference is dehumanization in both society and the academy. The academy presumably theorizing the dehumanization we find in society. The cat. So as my title suggests, I'm making a distinction between academic theorizing and the social reality that academic theorizing is presumably about. As my title further suggests, I'm focusing my remarks on the academic theorizing and on the various forms of dehumanization we find there. The fact of the matter is that the contemporary academy does not necessarily theorize the dehumanization we find in society. On the contrary, as the organizers of this conference themselves suggest, not only does the academy often refrain from theorizing the dehumanization we find in society, but rather celebrates and promotes its own form of dehumanization as if it were something good. How could dehumanization be something good? Well, how dehumanization might be something good, and whether it actually is, will be part of what my talk is about. But first, let me say something about my use of the stilted word, the academy. I use that word because, again, as the conference organizers themselves recognize, when we speak about social theorizing, we're talking about more than just the social sciences. We're talking also about psychology, which is not exactly or always social. And we're talking also about the humanities, including political theory, which distinguish themselves from science. And in fact, it's from the humanities and political theory, and from philosophy and cultural studies in particular, that much of academic dehumanization originates, although psychology and computer science contribute their share as well. The conference organizers imply that dehumanization is not good, and in their write-up, they suggest critical realism is a counter-movement that promises to rehumanize both the academy and society. Maggie Archer, Tony Lawson, Andrew Sayer, and Christian Smith are all cited as sketching the contours of a humanist social science. In my own recent book, I likewise declare that critical realism is a humanism. So I too tend to think of humanism as something both good and important, and of dehumanization as something importantly bad. It turns out, however, that we critical realists are largely out of a loop of contemporary discussion that problematizes both the human and humanism. We're largely out of this discussion, even though it has made what it calls an ontological turn that mentions but mostly marginalizes Bhaskar and critical realism, but also often duplicates without attribution critical realist positions. There's an introduction to critical realism by Jose Lopez and Gary Potter called After Postmodernism. The implication of the title is that after academia becomes exhausted with postmodernism, it will turn naturally to critical realism. Well, no such luck. Academia has become exhausted with postmodernism, so much so that it is very difficult today to find anyone who ever was a postmodernist. They were all, they say, always post-structuralists. And post-structuralism is still with us, as is its anti-humanism, which now, after postmodernism, takes the different forms identified by my subtitle. In fact, according to feminist philosopher Rosie Braidotti, who directs the Center for the Humanities at Utrecht University, post-structuralist anti-humanism is one of the main sources of contemporary post-humanism. More specifically, according to Richard Grusin, a professor of English and director of the Center for 21st Century Studies at the University of Wisconsin, the non-human turn in theorizing embraces the following currents: Bruno Latour's actor network theory, affect theory, assemblage theory, new brain or neuroscience, feminist new materialism, and varieties of speculative realism, including object-oriented philosophy and panpsychism. In what I say, I'll unpack these various currents. Some of the younger scholars among us, Tim Rutsu, Mark Kerrigan, and Andrea Maccarini, for example, have been more attentive to these developments than have older scholars like me. Although Mervyn Hartwig and Roy Bhaskar were also onto this stuff too in their work on meta-reality. For me, it was in fact only when invited to speak on this conference theme that I fully plunged myself into this more recent literature, which in new ways and for new reasons problematizes of what we think of as the human and humanism. So what I want to do in this talk is report on my journey through what, for me at least, were new lands and new ideas with which, after postmodernism, critical realism needs more concertedly to familiarize itself. Although I'm going to focus on dehumanization within academic theory, I don't want completely to overlook dehumanization within actual social reality. In this connection, the conference organizers speak of dehumanized social relations that express themselves as alienation, disenchantment, and loss of solidarity. They speak specifically of commodification and bureaucratization. But in what sense are these sorts of conditions, commodification or bureaucratization, dehumanized? How can they be dehumanized if they're the product of human interaction? What do we mean by the human here, or its absence? In her 2013 book, The Post-Human, Rosi Braidotti, the feminist philosopher I mentioned earlier, likewise tries to orient us with some real-world examples. One of her anecdotes involves a shooting attack on high school students in Finland, in which the shooter, a high school student himself, wears a t-shirt bearing the caption, "Humanity is overrated." A second anecdote speaks of a U.S. drone attack in Libya, on a convoy in Libya. And the third country has starving Afghani children eating grass, with biotechnical industrial farming that fattens cows, sheep, and chickens on animal protein. Again, as with bureaucracy and commodification, we have to ask, in what sense do Brody's examples reflect the non-human or post-human? Clearly, marginalization of the human element, in the marginalization of the human element, drone warfare signifies something post-human. And the assessment that humanity is overrated is certainly not pro-human. The third anecdote, however, is more complex, the one that contrasts children eating grass with grazing animals being unnaturally fed animal protein. On the one hand, that contrast seems to suggest an underrating of humanity, as the animals are eating better than the people, except that they're not. It is not conducive to the flourishing of grazing animals that they're fed animal protein. In humanity's pervasive commodification and instrumentalization of animals, we humans seem to be overrating ourselves, seemingly privileging our own flourishing at the expense of the animals. In linguistic terms, a stressed adjectival variant of humanity is the word humane. Humane connotes compassion, and inhumane, its absence. It is with the absence of compassion we have to do in Braidotti's examples. Essential meaning of compassion is fellow feeling. So there's a double absence of fellow feeling in Braidotti's third example. An absence of humanity's fellow feeling for the starving children, and then an absence of humanity's fellow feeling for the animals that humans commodify and instrumentalize. If there is such a thing as human dignity, is there not also a dignity associated with animals, a dignity that is affronted by how we treat them? So, in part, post-humanism is calling us to extend our fellow feeling beyond our own species. But this post-humanist call arises largely within the discourse of post-structuralism. The way to win an argument in post-structuralism is to frame what you oppose as the favored pole of a binary opposition. That placement morally delegitimates whatever it is you oppose, and thus wins you half the battle. It evidently goes unnoticed by post-structuralists that the non-binary has meaning only in relation to the binary, so that the non-binary itself is the top of a binary opposition, making a principled opposition to binary oppositions a performative contradiction. But I digress. In line with deconstructing binaries, Braidotti calls for a non-dualistic understanding of the nature-culture interaction to replace the opposition between the given and the constructed. Similarly, Brian Massumi, who introduces affect theory, calls for an end to the rigid divide between the human and the non-human. In his 2010 book, What is Post-Humanism?, Professor of English Carrie Wolf calls for us to transcend the dichotomy between humanity and animality. Jane Bennett's Vital Materialism seeks to dissipate the ontotheological binaries of life, matter, human, animal, will, determination, and organic, inorganic. And finally, according to another English professor I mentioned earlier, Richard Grusin, who edits a 2015 volume based on a 2012 conference on the non-human turn, the various forms of post-humanism share a refusal of such logical oppositions as the human, non-human, and subject-object. For practitioners of the non-human turn, Grusin says, what is problematic about these dualisms is their insistent privileging of the human. We begin to see the appeal of Bruno Latour's actor network theory, or ACT. It is not just, as I had suggested in Reconstructing Sociology, that people miss Ant's conflation of causal and human agency. They do. But what I missed is the greater appeal of Ant's nonpartisan blend of the human and non-human, expressed by Latour's Parliament of Things, his non-privileging of the human. With looming ecological disaster and widespread repulsion at industrialized animal husbandry, Latour's post-humanism captures the temper of the times. You see the same sensibility in what is called speculative realism. That is the object-oriented ontology of Graham Harman, or the object-oriented philosophy of Levi Bryan, who, like Latour, entitles one of his books, The Democracy of Objects. The same with feminist new materialism. Thus, the subtitle of Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter is A Political Ecology of Things. Yes, Bennett essentially goes over, tediously in my view, beautifully in the view of her post-structuralist admirers, a by now banal critical realist point that matter is not inert, but filled with causal agency. But we critical realists, I'm thinking particularly of myself, we miss the point if we think the point is just a post-structuralist failure to distinguish human agency from causal powers. There is that, but beyond it is the deeper sensibility that as the world is comprised of more than just the human, the non-human too must be given voice. As I mentioned, one of the post-human currents is called affect theory, introduced by Canadian philosopher Brian Massumi. I have to say that there's something extremely compelling about its insight. Massumi argues that quite apart from any signifying content, we can be persuaded just by the effective feel of a message or its purveyor. That insight helps us to understand my country's current politics. I assure you that most Americans know that Donald Trump is talking utter rot. It is just that many Americans don't care, because they are nevertheless attracted by his affect of can-do hopefulness. And although they also know that Trump is a pathological liar, they're still more attracted by his affect than by the affect of poor Hillary Clinton, who nobody trusts. It is with affect we have to do here, rather than with the representational content of what is said or done. And so it is also, I think, with post-humanism. Beyond the analytical mistakes of post-humanism is its appealing ecological affect. Indeed, the very analytical mistakes of post-humanism, its conflation of causal and human agency, actually contribute to post-humanism's appeal. The very elision of causal and human agency connects up with an emerging panpsychism that wants to see elements of mind in all matter down to elementary particles. Beyond the post-structuralist post-humanists, we see that panpsychism also defended by analytical philosophers like Galen Strawson and Thomas Nagel. And we see it actually also in Roy's The Philosophy of Mental Reality. There's something very appealing about such panpsychism that bespeaks cosmic community. One major problem for us critical realists, particularly first wave critical realists, is that we tend to be less affected by affect. We are too analytical, too much what Donald Trump would describe as low energy. So despite all the high energy enthusiasm for cosmic communitas, we get bogged down by boring, tedious analytical questions. Again, I'm thinking particularly of myself. So I say to myself, yes, it is good to extend fellow feeling and compassion to animals, and maybe even to rocks and neutrinos. But is there really no value difference between the human and non-human? There's a question Andrew Collier addresses in Being and Worth. But as that book was a low-energy analytical effort, it gets ignored. So let me try to pose the question in a higher energy way via personal anecdote. I apologize, some of you have heard it before. But the anecdote, I think, both discloses a post-human cultural shift even beyond post-structuralism and points simultaneously to what is at stake in the effacement of the human. So my teaching style is to be a Socratic provocateur. So one day I suggested to my students, provocatively I thought, that everything that religions call the soul is socially created. My students were not provoked, but perplexed. Everything they told me has a soul. Now I was perplexed. Everything I asked, you mean like rocks? No, of course not rocks, they replied as if I were being dense. Just life. My students had evidently not yet encountered panpsychism. So I pressed them further. Is there anything I asked that makes humans special or distinct? No, they told me. No. What about human rights? I asked. Just a human construct, they told me. I then replied that the previous summer my wife had me go out to our porch to exterminate a nest of wasps. I told my students I felt rather guilty about this mass extermination, but followed orders. So I asked my students whether there was anything different about killing 10,000 wasps and killing 10,000 human beings. This question seemed to stump my students, and they went two ways. Some just said they didn't know. Others stuck to their guns. No difference. I found this reaction a bit scary. There is, in short, an important question being evaded in the deconstruction of the binary that separates the human from the non-human. Like my students, I also think that what we call human rights are socially constructed, but not the ontological value we accord human beings that stands behind those rights. But what is that value, and what is its basis? What are we defending when we defend the human and humanism? Here, I follow the English professor Carrie Wolf I earlier mentioned, in turning to the Wikipedia entry on humanism, at least the entry at that time. Humanism, Wikipedia tells us, is the broad category of ethical philosophies that affirms the dignity and worth of all people based on the ability to determine right and wrong by appeal to universal human qualities, particularly rationality. See, this is why I like Wikipedia. It tells us here pretty much what I thought humanism was all along. It tells us that humanist approaches affirm the dignity and worth of all people universally, and it tells us that worth is based on certain qualities that humans possess, namely their rationality and moral agency. So there are 5 things to notice here in the Wikipedia entry, 4 of which will become targets of anti-humanist attack. First of all, there is, as Wikipedia describes, an essentialist universal quality to humanism. What humanism describes to all humans universally as a category. Humanism describes what is humanly shared rather than different. That's the first thing, universalism. Second, in speaking of the dignity and worth of human beings, humanism, without denying the worth of the non-human, is affirming something special about humans. So it's upholding what critics will call human exceptionalism. That's the second. Third, the exceptional value that humanism accords humanity, the exceptional value that humanism accords humanity, resides in human mental function. That's third. And fourth, that distinctive mental functioning is specifically rationality and moral agency. Finally, fifth, if human worth and dignity depend on mental qualities that humans share, then in principle those qualities might also be shared by beings that are non-human, like Klingons or Vulcans on other planets, like androids dreaming of electric sheep, or even some non-human animals that here on Earth that may have escaped our notice, possibly dolphins and pigs, octopi and parrots. In which case those beings too would have the same dignity and worth and possess the same rights as human beings. And in fact, if the androids we eventually built have greater rationality and moral agency than we do, then we perhaps are on the road to a trans-human future that is truly post-human in a different sense. To keep these 5 features of humanism better in mind, let us encapsulate them in single words. In single words, humanism is universalist, I'm trying to get my hand in there, universalist, exceptionalist, mentalist, rationalist, and paradoxically, in a sense, non-exceptionalist. So what's putatively wrong with all of that? Let me go through the criticisms in a logical rather than a chronological order, beginning with 2 I consider most easily dismissed. The first is the post-structuralist feminist charge of essentialism or universalism. Irene van Staveren launches this charge against Tony Lawson, arguing the following. The feminists in the dialogue perceive a strong version of universalism in Lawson's position. That is essentialism, a claim about the nature of human beings, a claim against which the whole project of feminism is set up, in particular post-structuralist feminism. Lawson treats this critique very sensitively. I have much less sympathy for it. First, although Van Staveren catches herself, she still goes to print with the suggestion that feminism is to be equated with post-structuralist feminism. Post-structuralist feminism's obsession with difference over identity invokes its own binary distinction, one we would do better to turn on its side rather than dissolve, because if we lose the correlative distinction between difference and identity, we can't talk much about either. How, for example, can you talk about differences among humans without first identifying humans as a category, which involves some kind of universal criteria? Oddly, Rosie Braidotti's own post-structuralist feminist critique of humanism is that humanism is not universal enough. She writes, the generic figure of the human is consequently in trouble. We know by now that the standard which was posited in the universal mode of man has been widely criticized precisely because of its partiality. Universal man, in fact, is implicitly assumed to be masculine, white, urbanized, speaking a standard language, heterosexually inscribed in a reproductive unit, and a citizen of a recognized polity. After this exposition, Braidotti comments, how unrepresentative can you get? Well, in the first place, what does Braidotti mean by representative, if not universally inclusive? So which is it? Is humanism too universal or not universal enough? The more fundamental problem with Bredotti's question is that it attacks a straw man, or, to be inclusive, an Aunt Sally. Sure, if you pack enough negative qualifiers into what is meant by humanism, it is going to be unacceptable. But the Wikipedia entry on humanism does not say anything about humans necessarily being male or white or urban, and none of those qualities are what anyone sensible today would think are essential to being human. Maggie Archer certainly does not mention those things in her book of that title. Even Bredotti herself finally concedes that after taking on board a feminist anti-humanist critique, we still need something like what Tony Lawson calls a minimal humanism. But I actually don't want to dismiss Bredotti's critique too soon, as I think there are elements of it that are important for us to consider, particularly concerning humanism's elements of mentality and rationality. We can concede that both mentality and rationality have traditionally been aligned with masculinity, with the feminine aligned with the body and emotionality. But neither pair of distinctions is analytically supportable. Contrary to the first pair, men too have bodies and women too have minds. Regarding the second pair, the distinction between rationality and emotionality is untenable. There are rational and irrational emotional responses, just as there are rational and irrational beliefs. And unless, like even Mr. Spock, we find things emotionally curious or fascinating, our logic will not take us anywhere. So if we continue to associate humanism with rationality, it must be a broader rationality that at least includes emotionality. Even with that broadening, there's a problem with an exclusive identification of the human with rational modes. Are we just minds, or are we not also embodied? According to Wolff, the human of humanism is achieved by escaping or repressing not just its animal origins in nature, the biological and evolutionary, but more generally by transcending the bonds of materiality and embodiment altogether. Similarly, Grusin associates bodily material processes with the non-human. Non-human, at least insofar as they're beyond the rational mentality of the human as represented by humanism. The problematic nature of humanism's identification of the human with our rationality has a dual nature that manifests most clearly in the non-post-structuralist form of post-humanism associated with the trans-human movement. According to Max Moore, one of the leaders of this movement, transhumanists are those who seek the continuation and acceleration of the evolution of intelligent life beyond its current human form and human limitations, especially by developing and making widely available technologies to eliminate aging and greatly enhance human intellectual, physical, and psychological capacities. It is the transhumanists' commitment to the evolution of intelligent life beyond its current human form that makes them post-humanists. On the other hand, it is their continued identification of rationality as that which is of value in humanity that makes them what critics like Wolff describe as intensified humanists. The transhumanists are a mixed bag, a hybrid differentiated community. They share certain traits with the post-structuralists. They do share certain traits with the post-structuralists. No one can accuse the transhumanists of repressing embodiment. Most transhumanists are reductive physicalists, which makes them as pro-body as you can get. Also, like the post-structuralists, the transhumanists, drawing on neuroscience, don't believe in the Cartesian view of the mind or self as a unitary, indivisible, and transparent entity. And with Donna Haraway, transhumanists are happy to say we have always been hybrid beings who should therefore have no qualms about cyborgs. Nor are transhumanists human exceptionalists. As Moore goes on to tell us, transhumanists regard human nature not as an end in itself, not as perfect, and not as having any claim to our allegiance. Instead, according to Moore, in addressing moral and ethical concerns, transhumanists typically adopt a universal standard based not on membership in the human species, but on the qualities of each being. Creatures with similar levels of sapience, sentience, and personhood are accorded similar status no matter whether they are humans, animals, cyborgs, machines, or aliens. In fact, not only are the transhumanists not human exceptionalists, like Nietzsche, the transhumanists see current humans as just a step towards the superhuman. As Ben Goertzel, another movement leader, puts it, at a certain point, humans will not be the most generally intelligent beings on the planet. Of course, as I mentioned, even if the transhumanists are not quite human exceptionalists, they, unlike the post-structuralists, might still be considered intensified humanists in rejecting panpsychism and upholding a value difference between beings with at least human intelligence and those without it. The transhumanists tend to be Popperian rationalists with a correspondingly strong individualistic libertarian streak. As hyper-rationalists of the type associated with Skeptic magazine, the transhumanists also tend to be strongly anti-religious. I mention this attribute as it bears on one prong of what I suggested is the dual nature of the problem associated with humanism's identification of the human with rationality. I did not recite the rest of the Wikipedia entry on humanism, but part of it tends to equate humanism with secular humanism. Without being essentialist about religion, some religious sensibilities would not equate the sanctity of human beings with our mental properties alone. From those perspectives, and they need not be only religious, there's a limit to what we are entitled to do with our bodies, beyond which what we do is not enhancing but desecrating. Although I'm religious myself, my own sympathies lie more with the transhumanists in this regard, but that might reflect my own humanist blind spot. In any case, I think there's an issue here that deserves greater reflection. Let's turn, though, to the second prong of the problem associated with humans' identification of humanity with rationality. The problem concerns the ontological status of rationality. If we think of rationality broadly as reasoned or minded behavior, at least we critical realists, we think of it as occupying an emergently irreducible level of activity. Although we critical realists use the word mechanism, we think of human behavior as teleological and goal-directed, as opposed to mechanistic in a purely physical sense. And we do not think the one can be reduced to the other. But suppose teleology can be reduced to the mechanistic. The whole thrust of contemporary psychology is to show that it can be so reduced. To show that mind is a product of neurophysiological processes that are not teleological in nature. That prospect is reinforced by developments in computer science, namely artificial intelligence or AI. In particular, considerable progress has been made in AI via what are called neural networks, modeled on what is thought to be the operation of the brain. And correspondingly, both psychologists and philosophers of mind have been drawn to a computational model of mind that thinks of the brain as a kind of computer. Popular in this respect is what is called Constructionism, which is modeled after the neural network approach in AI, which is modeled after what the brain is presumed to be doing. So there is this broad synthesis between psychology and AI that is anti-humanist in nature. Anti-humanist in its targeting of what it too calls the Cartesian subject, the centered consciousness that is the I behind the I think. That anti-humanism leads to philosopher Daniel Dennett's position that what he calls the intentional stance is just an epistemic utility, a useful heuristic that one might apply even to chess-playing computers, where there is no ontological I doing the computer's thinking, but only neural networks reinforced by the experience of correct play. So it is, Dennett avers, with us. And our English professor, Carrie Wolf, agrees. Citing Dennett, he rejects any homunculus inside us, any inner puppet pulling the strings. Instead of a centered consciousness, we are each, he thinks, although he does not use the word, we are each an assemblage of distributed or parallel neural networks. And being a good post-structuralist, Wolf links Dennett with Derrida, but also oddly for a post-structuralist, with Nicholas Luhmann, whose concept of autopoiesis now actually finds much currency in post-humanist circles. And of course, it's not just post-structuralists who celebrate the anti-humanist death of the Cartesian subject. Although he has now backed off some from it, psychologist Jonathan Haidt has famously pictured discursive consciousness as the rider on an elephant comprised of non-conscious autonomic processes. It's an image now hardly embraced in sociology by those taking the practice turn, who likewise want to displace any Cartesian subject. Because, like America's Jeb Bush, I am a low-energy type, let me interrupt all this Dionysian reveling in the death of the subject with some heavy Apollonian reflection. Again, I ask that we think about what is at stake here. I know that some critical realist readers of my recent book have balked at my defense of the Cartesian subject. But remember, perhaps not so low energy after all, I am by nature a provocateur. Or as my Italian father used to call me, a scutch, one who delights in annoying other people. So in speaking of the Cartesian subject, I'm trying to provoke the provokers. It is not some Cartesian dualism I'm defending, but what the anti-humanist provokers attack, a centered subject of experience. To those who deny there is anything such, I ask whether there's suffering in the world. If there is, I say that that which suffers is the self. It may be comprised of distributed neural networks, but it is centered enough to feel, and out of that feeling, to respond. Let me put the point another way. Alan Norrie has organized a stream in this conference on love, which I am particularly sorry to miss. Now, it seems to me, whether you go back to Levinas or before him to Martin Buber, if you're talking about love, you're talking about a relation that is I-thou rather than I-it. But if there's no I, then there also is no thou. We're instead all it's. Nothing to love or care about. Not women, not transgendered people, not no one. Occupying our bodies, no thou is at home. So, again, the stakes are large concerning subjectivity. But again, perhaps nobody is at home. It has to be conceded that in computer science, artificial intelligence has advanced tremendously. Back in 1978, a book entitled What Computers Can't Do, Hubert Dreyfus argued confidently that computers would never play championship-level chess. I agreed and said so in print. The number of different possible chess moves in a chess game is something like 10 to the 120th power, more than the number of atoms in the observable universe. The number of possibilities for the Sino-Japanese game of Go is even greater. So it did not seem that computational methods could suffice. Something beyond computation seemed required. Something like the intuition extolled by psychologist Jonathan Haidt. And yet in 1997, an IBM computer, Deep Blue, beat Garry Kasparov, the human world chess champion. Then in 2010, another IBM computer named Watson defeated the two best human champions at Jeopardy. At least they were still the game of Go, until this year. Just months ago, the computer DeepMind defeated the world's human Go champion. You can see why transhumanist Ben Gersel predicts the arrival of post-humans by 2045. Already, beyond the game players, we have computers that can solve mathematical problems and even compose original mathematical proofs. Also computers that perform reasonable face recognition and can reasonably translate and even take dictation. So it seems like humanism's vaunted rationality is not so special after all, nor irreducible to non-rational processes. It is actually Oxford philosopher Nick Bostrom, one of the leaders of the transhumanist movement, who raises our spirits. In his 2014 book, Superintelligence, he recalls for us the important distinction in AI between general and specialized intelligence. It seemed that to do many of the amazingly intelligent things that computers now do, they needed to possess the same kind of general intelligence we exhibit, an intelligence that can grasp the essence of what is called for in any new situation, an intelligence that is more akin to human understanding. Instead, it turned out that to do many of the amazing things computers now do, they don't need that kind of general intelligence or understanding. It turns out, as Bostrom tells us, that high-level play at games like chess and Go was achieved by surprisingly simple computational algorithms. The acclaimed neural network approach, Bostrom points out, actually reduces it to a kind of curve fitting like that associated with statistical regression. So Bostrom quotes computer scientist David Donald Knuth to the effect that AI has now succeeded in doing everything that requires thinking, but has failed to do most of what people and animals do without thinking. Somehow, that is harder. Thus, as Bostrom himself comments in a footnote, this is really an important point. Maybe what our brains do when we engage in explicit logical reasoning or calculation is in some ways analogous to running a virtual machine. So that one may say, somewhat fancifully, that a classical AI program is not so much emulating human thinking as the other way around. A human who is thinking logically is emulating an AI program. Consider the reversal here. In many contexts, computers now surpass us at the rationality that humanism thought distinguishes us. But it turns out that kind of rational thinking is actually not what distinguishes us. Well, if it's not rational calculation that makes human thought distinctive, what does? Bostrom lists perception, motor control, common sense, and language understanding. Certainly, language use is part of what is traditionally associated with humanism. But perception, motor control, and even to an extent common sense move us out of representation and back to non-representative bodily knowledge. And if the body is outside humanism's human, then we can understand Grusin's declaration that at the heart of the human is nothing human. As Grusin further puts it, in speaking of Masumi's affect theory, human affect systems are somatic and bodily. Affect systems operate autonomously and automatically, independent of, and according to Masumi, prior to, cognition, emotion, will, desire, purpose, intention, or belief, all conventional attributes of the traditional liberal humanist subject. It's not just the Cartesian subject that's being displaced here, but the discursive in general. Again, listen to Grusin, who tells us that the varieties of post-humanism are all opposed in one way or another to the more linguistic or representational turns of the 1970s through the 1990s, such as the textual, cultural, ideological, or aesthetic turns. In The Autonomy of Affect, Masumi argues that the representational has to give way in cultural analysis. There's a development here that is very much in line with critical realism, although one that leaves us largely sidelined. If what being is attacked is the representational, and the representational encompasses the textual, cultural, and aesthetic approaches, then under attack specifically are two of critical realism's own traditional opponents, discourse theory and social constructionism. And the attack comes from an ontological turn that has two sources. One is the feminist new materialism. The other takes its name from a conference that was held at Goldsmiths College at the University of London in 2007. And that name is Speculative Realism. Like us, the speculative realists are realists. And although they do not cite it by name or reference Bhaskar enough, they're equally opposed to the epistemic fallacy. Philosophers Bryan, Srinisek, and Harman write that phenomenology, structuralism, post-structuralism, deconstruction, and postmodernism have all been perfect exemplars of the anti-realist trend in continental thought. We critical realists would agree. In his 2010 book, After Finitude, the French philosopher Quentin Melissu coins the term correlationism to express the neo-Kantian premise that we can make no contact with things in themselves, but only with their cultural correlates as they impress themselves on us. The noumenal world just thus floats away, never to return, so that the only world we know is the world we create. Thus, like us, Masumi regards social constructionism as a form of cultural solipsism. As Rebecca Sheldon explains, the issue is most acute for feminism. Feminism deployed epistemology and social construction as avenues of counterattack against anti-feminist assertions of what is natural. Instead of counter-asserting realist style that what is claimed to be natural was not really so, feminism tended to efface the whole category of the real. This, as Donna Haraway once put it, nature cannot pre-exist its construction, an intentionally ambiguous assertion that fails to distinguish between what we critical realists call the transitive and intransitive dimensions. Now, we have within post-structuralist feminist circles itself the recognition of the binary opposition between the human and the non-human. As Rosie Braidotti observes, in its own way, social constructionism made man the measure of all things, and in the process deprived the non-human of all agency. So because that binary had to be deconstructed, we now have on the one hand Ant's conflation of human and causal agency, and on the other feminist new materialism, which discovers without any acknowledgement of critical realism that lo and behold, nature is not inert. Another way of abolishing the binary is to usher in quantum mechanics. This is the way of Karen Barad. It's true that at the quantum level, especially among entangled particles, things do not have stable properties apart from their relation with each other. Barad's move is to universalize that condition, not just for elementary particles, entangled or not, but for all things micro or macroscopic. For Barad, there are no things in themselves. Rather, things such as apparatuses are not static arrangements in the world that embody particular concepts to the exclusion of others. Rather, and I'm quoting Barad here, apparatuses are specific material practices through which semantic and ontological determinacy are interactively enacted. This is a kind of a performative theory where things become enactments. As Rebecca Sheldon puts it, Barad's agential realism insists that properties are products of local interactions between actants of many kinds. For Barad, relations precede relata, which then alter relations. As in the case of Rebecca Sheldon I just quoted, post-structuralist feminists like to describe their sisters not as arguing, but as insisting, which seems to foreclose opposition. Yet to the evident dismay of post-structuralist feminism, there is strong opposition. Forget Tony Lawson's counterclaim that there must be qualities that enduringly make anything what it is rather than something else. There must be qualities that enduringly make anything what it is rather than something else. Lawson's is a critical realist contention that does not register in this discourse. What does register is the opposition of philosopher Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology, which challenges frontally post-structuralist relationism such as Barad's. For Harman's ontology, relations are not primary as they are for Barad. Instead, for object-oriented ontology, it is, as Harman puts it, objects all the way down. That is, objects within objects, all preceding relations. Object-oriented philosopher Levi Bryant agrees, as does Timothy Morton, the Rita Shea Guffey Chair of English at Rice University. It is not just a relationalist reductionism that object orientology opposes. The talk of objects within objects is reminiscent of critical realism's talk of mechanisms. And while object-oriented ontology courts nominalist object reductionism, there is in object-oriented ontology, at least an appreciation, perhaps too much so, for the fixity and stability associated with the concept of mechanisms. Levi Bryant, in particular, speaks of machines. Among other things, machines and mechanisms are ways of speaking of causality and emergence. A rival causality of emergence is based on Deleuze's concept of assemblages, that again is more relational in nature. It shows up as assemblage theory in Manuel Delanda's A New Philosophy of Society, and it shows up in Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter. The assemblage concept remains obscure in Deleuze, but Delanda and also Tim Rutsu, in some recent pieces, help make it much clearer. What we essentially learn from them is that an assemblage is an emergent whole of heterogeneous parts, without essence, without coherence, without stable form. Instead of stable effects, assemblages are seething, changing vortices of unpredictable, uncontrollable forces. Let's consider the central example of Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter, the North American blackout of 2003. Here's her description of the power grid that went out. To the vital materialist, the electrical grid is better understood as a volatile mix of coal, sweat, electromagnetic fields, computer programs, electron streams, profit motives, heat, lifestyles, nuclear fuel, plastic, fantasies of mastery, static, legislation, water, economic theory, wire, and wood. The electric grid is better understood this way? As a concatenation of computer programs, profit margins, electromagnetic waves, and fantasies? Maybe this assemblage description is a better way to understand the electric grid if you're a post-structuralist feminist wanting to champion what Timothy Morton calls a lava lamp ontology of volatile forces. It is not a better way to understand the power grid if you're an electrical engineer trying to fix the damn thing. To create an image of vibrant movement, Bennett runs a roughshod over different levels of structure and causation. There's no attention to different discrete mechanisms operating in what Lawson would call demi-regular ways at different levels. To approach the grid analytically in that way would spoil the effect, which is to induce an affect, namely a positive sense of a lava lamp understanding of reality. I'm not denying that there are any phenomena in the world that are better understood as indiscriminate currents and flows, but I do not think that the power grid is one of them. And that signals the impropriety of privileging a priori fluidity over stability. Framed this way, we see that what is being pushed here is post-structuralism's own essentialism, based on its own rigid binary of fluidity over stability, which are rather always relative. It thus remains an empirical question whether any particular case is better approached in terms of fluidity or stability, or both, along the non-binary continuum. When it comes to complete fluidity, as far as I can see, feminist new materialism is still in need of a case. With that comment, my tour is complete, post-humanism, etc., and I return us home. I've tried to unpack the various strands behind these currents: actor network theory, affect theory, assemblage theory, feminist new materialism, and object-oriented ontology. These are the new movements that after postmodernism, critical realism must engage. Some of it is silly, and some of it just recapitulates what critical realists have better said decades ago. Some of it, though, is new and insightful, and we need to connect with it. Why, though, has critical realism been largely left out of this dialogue? It hasn't been completely left out, although not as much as it should be. Bhaskara is mentioned quite a bit by Levi Bryant, and at least in passing by Delanda. That is about it, though. You would never guess from the stream of discourse that decades before a prior philosophical movement had already made the ontological turn. Why is that? For one thing, much of this dialogue transpires within the confines of post-structuralism, which, despite all the commotion it makes about inclusion, is a fairly insular discourse, based on continental and particularly French thought. It thus differs in both substance and style from Anglo-American philosophical analysis. Whereas the French are given to grand gesture and aesthetic presentation, I have described the British analytical style of critical realism as low energy. It is true that the speculative realists and object-oriented philosophers share our style a good deal, but they are at least more rooted in French thought. If you look at the bibliography attached to the anthology and the speculative turn, which along with Nick Simasek, Levi Bryant, and Graham Harman co-edit, you see many references to Badiou, Deleuze, Derrida, and Lacan. And the volume is subtitled Continental Materialism and Realism, which accounts for the marginalization of critical realism in both the volume and the whole stream of discussion. But it's not only due to style and origin that critical realism is marginalized. A lot of the attention to speculative realism has grown via the blogosphere. In fact, I just came across a YouTube lecture featuring Graham Harman that had some 20,000 hits, and that begins with an illuminating exposition of the difference between continental and Anglophone philosophy that explains a lot. In contrast, although we have several well-maintained web pages and some prominent bloggers like Mark Harrigan, it is not a medium in which we are very well represented. In fact, Mark has a new book out called Social Media for Academics. It might be a good idea for us all to read it and take its advice. Thank you. I hope, when you talk to yourself for like 45 minutes, whatever I did, it all begins to sound like gobbledygook. I hope it came out clearer for you. I thank you for your attention and wish you all a great conference.